Senjadov, and I teach here at the Russian department at NYU. Thank you so much for making it here on a very sunny day, and especially to our students who are really taking time from their reading week. And thank you so much for coming. You're really in for a treat. But my task is, not to tell you what this treat is, but just to introduce the people who will be making it possible. And first, Christine Dunbar, who is the real organizer of this event. A former PhD student at Princeton. Christine is now running an Asian Humanities series at Columbia University Press. And also a new, from what I understand, initiative, a Russian library, which I hope at some point she will tell us a little bit about. Then, the real culprit, and the real reason why we're here, Tom Kitson, a graduate of Columbia's PhD program with a dissertation on Konstantin Leontiev. He then went on to hold a Columbia Harriman postdoc fellowship and proceeded to teach Russian language and literature at Montclair State, Drew in Columbia. Good to see you. Please. He has written and researched on Russian religious thought, Eastern Orthodoxy, German idealism, Romanticism and nationalism, canon formation and psychoanalysis. Восхищение, Rapture, is not his debut as a translator, but it is his first novel. From what I understand, new ones are forthcoming. Iliazd, Philosophia, and Emilia Dvortsova's At the Doors of the Sea from Bulgarian. We also privileged to have as a discussant Jen Wilson, whom probably some of you recognize, in her numerous capacities. Having completed her PhD in Slavic at Princeton, she's now a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. But you've probably come across her writing at The Guardian or other popular outlets, because she's one of the, in our field, Slavic studies, one of the major public intellectuals. So you know her through her work with the Association for Diversity in Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies, which she founded and chaired for many years. The event is co-sponsored by Penn World Voices, Columbia University Press, and Read Russia. And at the very back of this room, you will see the other culprits. The book that Tom translated by a really dramatic novel that we're here to learn about, and you can purchase copies and get Tom's signatures after the talk.
Thank you. I just want to echo Razan's thanks to the various culprits, as he called them, particularly Christine Dunbar for organizing all of this and the Jordan Center for hosting, but mostly to Thomas Kitson for doing the translating, for putting together the project that we're here to discuss. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about the biography of the author Iliazd, which I find really fascinating. I've been trying to convince you to write a biography. So he was born in Georgia in 1894 to a Polish father and a Georgian mother. That's correct? So what was the impact of that on his trajectory, being a Georgian writer? How did that affect his relationship to the Russian avant-garde?
I think that initially what he brought when he left Georgia, he grew up in a Russophone context. His father was from a Polish family where the grandfather had been exiled after the 1830 uprising in Poland, had been exiled to the Caucasus. And his mother was from a Georgian family. but at home they spoke Russian. His father was a French teacher, so the whole family was kind of up on French culture, and Iliazd as a teenager was very excited about what was happening in the French avant-garde, and especially futurists, the Italian futurists, Marinetti's publications in French language newspapers. So what he took to Petersburg when he went there to go to law school, to go to the law faculty, was probably more of an interest in the French avant-garde than Georgian at that point. He certainly was, he had spent time in village settings in Georgia, he had visited monasteries in Georgia, and he had some kind of feel for culture in Georgia, but I don't think that it really hit him until like his sense of having a strong connection to Georgia didn't hit him, I think, until during the First World War, when he, in 1915, he took a job as a war correspondent with the newspaper Riech on the Anatolian front. So he was following the Russian army into what's now Turkey, along the northern coast of Anatolia, along the Black Sea. And it took him through areas that had at one time been part of, and even central to, Georgian culture. Like a lot of the medieval Georgian architecture was in these areas. Then a little bit later, he went back to Petrograd to finish his law degree, and just as he finished, the revolution came in 1917, and he was there in Petrograd for the spring, doing a lot of work among artists. There was a movement among some of the world of art figures to create a government department that would kind of administer the arts, and Zdaniewicz was very much opposed to this and worked very hard against it. But then when it came time for various associations of artists to choose their leaders, he was completely left out. And in part that's because he was known as a poet, but he had never actually published anything. So he wasn't really recognizable in that way. He was kind of a provocateur. He had done a lot of lectures, caused a lot of scandals, public scandals. So he's completely crestfallen, and at that moment he was invited back to Georgia to join an archaeological expedition that was being sent into these areas that were occupied at that time by the Russians, to go and study the architectural ruins, to go and do different kinds of field work in villages in the mountains there, and really with that expedition he, I think, developed a very strong sense of being Georgian.
What does that mean for his art?
Well, I think in Rapture there are some elements of medievalism. There are certainly visual elements, and there's the church where Brother Moki's funeral takes place is definitely a description of one of these ruined churches that he was a draftsman, and he made the architectural drawings of these ruins for the expedition. They were later published in 1952 without his name on them, because by then he was out of the Soviet Union. But it also, simultaneously, he developed a real hatred for Russia. He saw what the Russian army did to the villages in these occupied territories, and that also got him to thinking about, I guess, being a colonized people in Georgia. So much of his life later on, he's very vocally announcing, "I'm not Russian." And during the Civil War, Georgia had an independent existence, and was spared a lot of the carnage of the Civil War. And when Zdanevich made it to Paris, again, he would say, you know, I have a Georgian passport for this country that doesn't exist anymore, because by the time he got to Paris, Georgia had been swallowed up by the Soviet Union, or what was soon to be the Soviet Union. But he would always say, I'm not Russian, and this didn't endear him to the emigré community in Paris, certainly.
So you mentioned his fascination with Marinetti's Futurist Manifesto. I think what's interesting is that fascination arose when he was just 14. He was, you know, obsessed with Italian futurism as a teenager, and, you know, at 14 was writing his own poetry in the symbolist style, sort of odd habits for a teenager. What accounts for this really early interest in the avant-garde, do you think?
That's hard to say. I mean, his brother was equally interested. His brother, who was a painter and visual artist, was equally interested. I don't really know what caused that.
Yeah.
But then out of it came, I think he had a desire early in his career. He also had a strong desire to just become famous, to become well known. And the first event in Moscow where he provokes a scandal with his lecture about futurism. You know, he writes home to his mother. It's like, you know, now everybody knows my name. Everyone knows who I am, and it's like that's the most important thing. And that also switches. I think the war changed a lot of things in him. And it changed his attitude also toward the Marinetti, the kind of speed and power, mechanization, the glorification of war. At the beginning of the war, Zdanevich became almost notorious for being one of the few people who, in the fall of 1914, was openly rejoicing about the German bombardment of the cathedral in Reims, I think it was. So you know, here this war is coming. It's a futurist war. It's bringing modern mechanized culture, and it's destroying the old world. We're going to get it out of the way. But by 1915, 1916, he's completely turned around on that. And all of his writing later has a deep sympathy for the suffering, the people who were suffering who suffered through the war, and then in the aftermath of the war, the refugees.
So in 1911, he goes to St. Petersburg to study law. So, you know, obviously crime and violence are really big parts of this novel. So, you know, was he attracted to law for that reason?
I don't think he was very much attracted to law
at
all. Although he was interested in kind of legal psychology. So in some of his seminars in the law faculty, he was bringing material from Freud and trying to introduce a different kind of psychology into the mix there. And then he takes juridical formulas and starts to kind of repurpose them and reinterpret them in his poetry and in his writing. So there's this a central phrase that's through all of his writing after he actually starts publishing poetry, which is 1916, 17, 18. There's one phrase which is a criminal attempt with unsuitable means, and this is a legal category. So somebody makes an assassination attempt, and it fails because they didn't know how to go about it correctly, or they chose the wrong way of going about it. And this is his encapsulation of what poetry always is. So he takes that, and that's the description of everything he does in his life. Is it's a criminal attempt at trying to reach this poetic ideal with necessarily always unsuitable means. he doesn't have it in him by definition, and nobody does.
So you mentioned that at the time he became very embroiled in these debates about the Russian avant-garde, within the Russian avant-garde. Where was he positioned? How did he see himself fitting into that environment?
He was, and again, this is part of not writing and not publishing any poetry. He was mostly associated through his brother with painters. So Natalia Goncharova and Mikhail Larionov primarily, and the circle of painters that were around them, and he participated in writing manifestos for their group. His first published work, which is under a pseudonym, was a kind of a catalog of their works up to that point in 1913. So he was really focused on painting, and most of his public speaking was also focused on painting. So he was involved in the polemics between different groups, and usually attacking the groups that were around Kazimir Malevich, and then also because Mayakovsky and Kruchonych and Khlebnikov were closely associated with that circle, he started attacking them as poets. And I think that's what started him thinking more about what's poetry, and if I'm attacking their poetry, what should it be like? What should I be doing?
Right. And he has this concept called everythingism, which I think is sort of the answer to that question, what should I be doing, right? He sort of suggests this new approach. Can you say a little bit about everythingism?
That also comes from his painter associations.
Okay.
So another figure in the circle with Larionov is a young painter who was very close to Zdanevich, Mikhail Lidantiu, and he ended up dying during the war. He was actually on his way back from the front in 1917, and there was a train accident, and he died in the train accident. But Lidantiu had come up with this notion of everythingism, and it was supposed to be a way of overcoming in the avant-garde, where you have this series of isms. So futurism and simultaneism and orphism and suprematism, and suprematism not yet, but you have this whole series of isms, and so Lidantiu came up with everythingism, which was focused then on what's the task at hand in every single artwork that the artist is involved in, and every means that has ever been developed by artists throughout human history is fair game as long as it makes sense for that particular project. So it's seen as also overcoming time. It's not futurism, and it's not mired in the past, but it has access to the past.
So when he writes this novel in Paris.
Yeah.
So can you explain how he gets to Paris from Russia?
So I guess
a lot happens.
Going back to some of the biography that I already had talked about, he was on this expedition in 1917, and after that he stayed in the independent Georgia during the Russian Civil War. He never went back to Petersburg, never went back to Petrograd or Moscow, and he stayed in Tbilisi, and it just happens that there were, in part because it was an area that was relatively peaceful, a lot of figures from the avant-garde ended up there, and so they had this flowering of the avant-garde in Tbilisi in 1918, 1919. So Alexei Kruchonych was there, and people who were not part of strictly the avant-garde. So there were acmeists like Sergei Gorodetsky, and there were local Georgian symbolists, and all these people were doing things together. And they were no longer so worried about the polemics between groups, which was kind of nice and fertile and creative. So Zdanevich kind of felt freed up because he wasn't putting all of his energy into attacking people all the time anymore. And he finally starts publishing things. So he's publishing these short dramas that are in transrational language or beyond sense language, that are the first dra, he calls them dra, short like drama. The first one is, it's supposed to be in Albanian, but it's something that's made up. That's mostly recognizable as phonetic Russian, so the orthography is completely non-standard. But and then it has little bits of pure nonsense thrown in, and it has little bits of other recognizable languages, and then in these dramas, not just for Zdanevich, but for some of the other figures there who were working a lot on Zaum and the transrational language. In Kručonich's work, but you can find also Georgian. So here, I mean, Georgian kind of becomes, for these people who are living there and listening to Georgian, and it seems very strange to them, they start incorporating Georgian words into this transrational language. And the same thing happened with like Armenian and Azerbaijani. But he and Kručonik and Igor Terentiev form what they refer to as a duet for three idiots, which is the main name for their group is 41 Degrees. And the symbolism of 41 Degrees is, this is something that's just typical for everything that Zdanevich does from there on out, which is trying to take every little bit of linguistic material and overloading it with semantic content. So depending on what context you put it in, it's going to mean something completely different. So 41 degrees is the latitude for Tbilisi. It's 41 degrees was supposed to be, they've reached fever pitch. So, you know, they're all sick with poetry. And 41 degrees is 1 degree more alcohol than vodka. So they're extremely drunk with poetry. 41 is the day that Christ returns from his temptation in the desert. 41 is also, I think it's the age when Zarathustra returns to the people from the mountains. And it also is, in Zdanevich's telling, it's also the latitude of a number of other extremely important cities in the world, which it actually isn't the latitude of, but he has a list of other cities that are supposedly sharing this latitude. If you go and check the globe, it's not true. But mystification is another big element in all of this. So I don't remember. I'm sure I forgot 3 or 4 more things that are 41 degrees. But that's
so one last question about his biography.
We didn't get to Paris yet.
Sorry. No, keep going. Then I'll ask my...
No. Do you want to be in Paris, or do you want to ask now?
Well, I think this happens in Paris. So he marries a Nigerian princess.
That's much later.
Okay,
yeah.
All right. So start with Paris,
Okay.
and then that's just my burning question that he answered at some point.
So all this is happening in Tbilisi, and in the meantime, the Russian Civil War is going on, and it's turning worse for the whites, but at the same time, there's news filtering through to these poets about what's happening with Dada, in what had been happening in Zurich during the war, what's going on in Paris now after the war, and in Berlin, and Iliazd, he's not Iliazd yet, but Zdanevich thinks, he thinks, I have something to show them, and they might be interested in this. And he always claimed that he was not like most of the people who ended up in Paris most of the Russians who ended up in Paris after the revolution, that he was not somebody who fled. He was somebody who was going toward something. There was something that was drawing him to Paris. So he he's been working, while he's doing the poetry, he's been supporting himself by working for various relief agencies, from United States and British relief agencies. And he manages to get himself passage out from Georgia to Istanbul. And he ends up waiting for a year in Istanbul to get a visa to France. While he's there, he does more studies of Byzantine architecture. He's develops more of his fascination with the architecture. Tries to learn a little bit about Turkish and Ottoman culture, and again tries to maintain a little bit of distance from the main groups of Russian refugees that have also inundated Istanbul right at that time, because it coincides with the conquest of Crimea by the Red Army, and you have, like, I don't know, 180,000 people at once leaving Crimea, and a lot of them end up in Istanbul. So he's there for a year, and then he gets his visa to Paris, just at kind of the tail end of Paris Dada, makes his contacts with the Dada people, and immediately decides, you know what, we're after different things. Like, there's something fundamentally different. But he creates friendly relationships with all of the different factions that are starting to form within Dada. So around Tristan Tzara, there's one group, and around André Breton, there's a group that's going to become very soon the Surrealists. But he finds a way of kind of cultivating all of them. And by 1923, the scandals at the Dada events were so notorious that none of the halls in Paris would rent to any of the Dada figures if they wanted to organize an event. So Zdaniewicz and his group of Russian artists were responsible for renting the hall for what's considered the last evening of Dada, where there was a big melee between Breton's group and Tzara's group, and they're beating one another with canes, and the police had to be brought in, and that's the end of Dada. But that's, Zdaniewicz is right in the middle of that. And he gives himself a new name pretty soon after he comes to Paris. He calls himself Iliazd, which is, again, it's a pun on a number of different, it's a combination of parts from his first name and his last name. It's also punning. Initially, it's in the feminine gender. It's Iliazda. And also in French, it's in the feminine gender. Later, he gets rid of the final vowel, and that's how he's known for the rest of his life, as Iliazd.
Why do you think he took on that feminine ending to begin with?
I think he also was developing a mythology about himself, how he had lived different periods of his life, one gender and then the other gender, switching back and forth. So the first years of his life he was a girl, and then he was a boy when he started going to gymnasium, and it's also part of, and he's deeply into Freud, and so he's interested in kind of the fluidity between masculine and feminine, and it's a play on the. I think again it's a reaction at some level to the kind of Marinetti, the same way that he had a reaction to this kind of speed, power, destruction, violence. It's a little bit of a reaction to the Marinetti, the hatred for woman, the hatred for the feminine, so which is another theme that's throughout Rapture.
Great. Yeah, well, you can see now why I want him to write a biography. Yes, very interesting life. So let's move on to the actual book. So for those who haven't read it, would you mind giving like a brief summary of the plot? I know it's a bit difficult. But
Well,
It goes in lots of directions, but
the briefest summary is that there's a, I guess the protagonist of the novel is a bandit, or he's a young man who works at a sawmill and he wants to be free, and he becomes a bandit in order to be free. And then he goes on a number of adventures looking for treasure. And he's recruited by different people. He's recruited by criminals. He's recruited by revolutionary parties. And he never really has great success with his treasure seeking. He starts accumulating riches, but he doesn't know what to do with it. And he's not satisfied. Meanwhile, he's also met, in the mountains, he's met this beauty who's kind of a quasi-supernatural figure, and has carried her off. By midpoint of the book, they're expecting a child. Because of some of the things that he's been involved in the provincial capital, there are army squadrons that are after him. So he and Ivlita, this woman, are hiding out in a cave in the mountains, and he's also constantly moving back and forth between the sense of invincibility and defenselessness, and trying to find also how to come to terms with his responsibility for the crimes that he's committed. What is his responsibility? In the end, he's betrayed and captured, and he escapes from being captured. And I don't know, I mean, actually, say how it ends. Everybody turns into trees.
Quite a lot. Okay.
Everybody turns into trees.
Yeah.
But they're all dead. Everyone's dead.
Okay.
But the protagonist doesn't turn up really until the third chapter. So the first chapter is about a monk crossing the mountains, and the protagonist turns up at the end of the chapter, but we don't know that he's the protagonist yet. He's unnamed. So there's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of, I guess there's a lot of meta stuff about storytelling going on too. So.
Okay. Well, that's sort of my next question is sort of, why write this book? In 1927 is when he finishes it. Where does he see this book sort of fitting in with what's happening, artistically or politically at the time? Reading it, I felt like it was more of a book that should have been written in the 1910s. It just sort of felt like it was more, as you mentioned, about these sort of, squabbles between the early avant-garde. So 1927 felt kind of late for this subject matter, but am I wrong to feel that way?
I think you're right. It doesn't feel like, even though it has elements where you say, oh, this is happening in Georgia, or this is happening in the Russian Empire, and you have these revolutionary parties, there's nothing that feels particularly topical about it. And it seems to be set in an atmosphere that's pre-war. I mean, I guess we can kind of assume that it's pre-war. I think his main objectives are all related to where he is thinking about poetry at that moment and thinking about art at that moment. So at one level, it's a summing up of the whole Russian futurist movement. This protagonist, the bandit, is supposed to be a portrait of Vladimir Mayakovsky. There are characters in the book that are supposed to be Zdanevich himself.
You said so it's a Romana play, you said.
At one level, it has this...
About the Russian avant-garde, So as you mentioned, the novel is set in this mountain range that's sort of never named, but I read it as the Caucasus. And I was wondering if you agree, is this probably the Caucasus? And if so, is this in dialogue in any way with what's called the Caucasian theme in Russian literature, Prisoner of the Caucasus, and a kind of Southern Orientalism?
It's and most readers will say it's the Caucasus, and again, there's a lot of realia that points that way. There are certain scenes, views that the characters have that are again things that are almost reproduced verbatim from Iliazd's notebooks about when he was climbing a certain mountain and the view that he had from that mountain. But at the same time, he's not specific about where it is. He doesn't give specific place names, so there's a hamlet where a lot of the action takes place, which is just the unpronounceable hamlet. It has a name that nobody can say. Its inhabitants can't say it. Nobody can say the name of the hamlet. There's another village that's just known as the village with the sawmill. And there's a provincial capital, which is just the provincial capital. And when you get to place names, you get things like the Grand Boulevard, so it could be anywhere.
Yeah.
He was interested in mountain culture, village culture generally. So when he was in France, he loved to go hiking in the Pyrenees. And there's also kind of the Albanian theme from the early dramas, and then some people writing about this novel will say that this is also taken from the Albanian theme. I think probably at some level he's in dialogue with the Caucasian theme in Russian literature. I recently reread Lermontov's Diemen just to see whether anything comes from that. But I found especially the treatment of the female characters just very different.
How so?
It felt like Tamara in Diemen, Tamara was pretty helpless and passive, and here Ivlita is a real force in this novel, not just an object of desire, and not just an object of Lawrence's treasure seeking, but she has a lot of initiative in this novel. She's also, one of the weird things to me with this novel, or one of the developments speaking about poetry, you kind of have a situation here where you could read at some level Ivlita is traditionally the muse, and you have all these male figures that are the poets trying to kind of find some relationship with her. But there's another level in the novel where she is just as much a seeker after whatever it is that all of these people are trying to find. So she does have this existence that's at some other level. She's treated both by the narrator and by characters within the novel as a being who's not quite of this world. She has fairy tale characteristics, like, there's some question as to whether she was born or not. There's a story about her birth, but then very soon after, the narrator talks about how she emerged one day from the mist behind her father's house. Her father is never sure whether she's his daughter or his dead wife. She has this existence that isn't very well defined, and but she's a seeker. There's, I guess, another thing that's kind of getting stuck on top of whatever the Caucasian theme that's kind of traditional in Russian literature, and it's something that I've been more keyed to, is the kind of Nietzschean mountain theme. And so the main characters, one is the monk at the beginning who has this journey up into the mountains, and he dies in the first chapter, but he doesn't disappear from the novel, and he's also very active through the novel. So he has this mountain experience, and that is repeated in different ways by Ivlita. She has a similar experience, and Lawrence has an experience that echoes that as well, although in his case, again, it's something that's more, it's something where he falls out of a cave, and when he comes to after being knocked out, he's actually up on a glacier that's much higher than the cave that he fell out of. And there's a feature of this novel where a lot of things that should be going down by gravity are actually going up. And but he has this experience almost inadvertently, so it's not in his quest to be free and to always do things voluntarily and never to be coerced into doing anything. Even his kind of highest poetic experience is something that happens to him inadvertently. It's not something that he kind of willed.
You mentioned that Iliazd is very critical of this idea of the muse, this sort of idealized woman who's just there to inspire while men go out and create. And that's very much present in the novel. And I was just wondering where you think that comes from, where that sort of urge to critique the figure of the muse comes from for him.
It's
and is it connected to that kind of gender bending sort of interest that he
I'm
has?
sure it's partially the gender bending issue, but it's also a response to Russian symbolism, to the or even a development of some of the things in Russian symbolism with the like Blok with the Prekrasnaya Dama, with the fair lady who turns into the Neznakomka, the stranger who's like a prostitute or something like that. There's a development from that. There's Ivlita has some features that that hark back to the symbolist's use of Vladimir Solovyov's interest in the eternal feminine. But again, it's all kind of twisted up here. So it's.
And I'm really interested in the title Rapture. I know in the introduction you said that Iliazd tried to claim that rapture is the feeling that people had waiting for Lenin's train to get in from Finland in 1917, and like that was the emotion, was rapture, and that rapture is the feeling of the revolution. But you also sort of suggested that maybe he was just doing that to try to get published.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering what you think the real meaning of this title is then.
Yeah, that's what Jen is referring to in the publication history of the book. He wrote it in Paris, and he sent it to his brother, who was still in the Soviet Union and wanted to have it published there. And when he sent it, there was a pretty good chance of it actually getting published, because it was the period where they were still publishing so-called fellow travelers. And Zdeněvich was a leftist all his life. He was never somebody who repudiated the communists, or so he could easily have been a fellow traveler. But his manuscript arrived just at the moment when that opportunity was shutting down in the Soviet Union. So they read his manuscript, and the Soviet editors said, "Nah, we can't publish this. It's too loose about where it takes place. It doesn't designate time and place. It's kind of indifferent to its characters. It has some kind of a mystical spirit in the book, and it opens with a monk. So we can't do this." They also said it read like something that had been translated from another language into Russian. And one of the readers said it's an illiterate book. So Iliazd was kind of incensed by this. But he wrote a reply to try to get it published, and it is almost mocking in its kind of attempt to. One of the things that he did was say, I was in the crowd in April 1917 when Lenin arrived at the Finland station, which is true, he was. And I saw the expression on the sailors' faces, and it was an expression of rapture, and that's what this book is about. It's a revolutionary spirit. And okay, it reads like a book that was translated from another language. That's great. We're all internationalists, aren't we? So, you know, he kind of came back at them with this. But the восхищение in Russian, he accented it differently from the way that we normally would say rapture in Russian, and he made it восхищение. So he emphasized the root that has to do with kind of predatory behavior, with seizure, so this is something that we talked about at the panel on Tuesday, was that for a long time this manuscript was existing with the title The Ravishing. And Rapture, you know, Rapture has this possibility of kind of going in two ways, where you have the ecstatic feeling, but it also, that ecstasy comes at the expense of like having yourself kind of ripped out of yourself, maybe. So there's that root. Iliazd uses it throughout the novel in different forms, and it's great in English because we can use ravishing and we can use rapture, and it takes us to ravening, and it takes us to rape, and it takes us to I had a whole bunch of these things. I can't remember now. What?
Lavish.
Well, okay, so the other thing is that there's a phonetic battle going on between L and R, and in English it's nice because then we can take ravish and we can oppose it to lavish, and so you have this kind of generosity that comes out. That's but in a lot of ways in the book there is this, you know, gradually everything is being taken away, and Lavrenti is being kind of emptied out. And I haven't thought of in these terms, but it's but there's a lot of play on the Gospel of John, and so there's almost like Lavrenti has to go through some kind of a canonic thing, like have everything, he has to be emptied out. But Rapture, throughout the book, you have both of these movements, and again, it's the up movement and the down movement, and these are being played on constantly with movement in the book, but also with conceptual movement, and it's I keep saying that it's not, you know, it's not a psychological novel. It's a novel that's kind of driven by other mechanisms, which is again something that Iliazd is interested in. So the Freudian things. You have the confrontation of Eros and Thanatos, different drives, and then you have these phonetic confrontations, and then just it's structured poetically. So you have situations that rhyme, situations that are inverted, situations that are recapitulated,
Great. So I have a bunch more questions, but I thought, you know, we would open it up to the audience, and just to make sure we have time for audience questions, because I've had the chance to talk to Thomas quite a bit already, even before this event, about the novel. So, Rosin?
The question originates out of the depths of my own ignorance about Iliazd Danevich. I'm just, you know, obviously it's a writer I knew about, but I've never really read nor understood the complexity of his biography until the beginning of your conversation. And I'm just wondering now, who now is interested in Zdanevich's legacy? I mean, I can imagine aficionados of the Russian avant-garde would be, you know, his natural readers, and so would scholars of Russian emigration. But outside of those two groups, Is there any interest, for example, in Georgia? Because the figure of a similar biography, Kurban Said, Kurban Said's Alienin has been embraced in both Georgia and Azerbaijan. Did he make any lasting connections with the French avant-garde that would merit any translations into French and an interest by French audiences?
Yeah, there's, well, for the Russians, the novel kind of disappeared. So he tried to publish it in the Soviet Union, he couldn't. And he was on these awful terms with the Russian emigré community and didn't really have any interest in having the leading publishing houses taking the novel. They may not have wanted it anyway, but I don't think he actually ever made any overtures to them. When he couldn't get it published in the Soviet Union, the first thing he did was he gave it to Valentin Parnach and said, translate it into French. And I guess in the archive there are 4 chapters of it that Parnach translated into French before he went back to the Soviet Union. So it didn't get translated into French. And in 1930, Iliazd, at his own expense, published it in 750 copies, and he gave a lot of those away. And then the ones that were left, the Russian booksellers in Paris wouldn't sell them. So it kind of disappeared. And he sent copies also to his associates who were still in the Soviet Union. So, of course, his brother was still there, but there were also other figures from his pre-war avant-garde days that were around. And copies of the novel were definitely circulating among a small group of people in the 1930s. But oddly, I don't know, I'm not sure exactly why, but when the Glasnost explosion in publishing came, a lot of other avant-garde poets who had not had huge editions before that were published, but Stanievich wasn't. I suspect, actually, his Zaum dramas were well known to Russians, and those certainly did get republished, I think. So the Russians knew these transrational dramas, but they didn't really know much of anything that he had done once he went to Paris. And but there were small groups, again, of connoisseurs who were interested in the avant-garde generally, who discovered him and started publishing, again, teeny tiny editions in the 90s. There was one publication of the novel in Russian here in the United States, in Berkeley, in the early 1980s, in 1983. And that introduced the novel to some emigres from Russia who were not aware of it before they were here in the United States. So then that created another very small audience. But the publications in the 90s were kind of in a milieu of people who, they were interested in avant-garde literature, but they were also interested in visual art, so they were being published through like art galleries. And Stanievich is best known in France, in Western Europe, and in the United States for the work he did after this, which was in artist book publishing. So he worked with Picasso and Max Ernst and Giacometti and Miro, creating these wonderful artist books that are in special collections all over Western Europe and the United States, and people who collect artist books, they're considered some of the high points of the 20th century for book arts. And there were exhibitions of his work in that field in the 80s at MoMA here in New York, and in Paris at the Pompidou Center. So that's what people knew in the West, but they didn't know his writing. And so now what you have is, in Georgia, there's been, since since the 90s, there's been a lot of interest in both Iliazd and his brother Kirill. There are museums there and museum exhibitions, and then over the last few years, the Russians, there was just a big exhibition winter 2015 to 2016. So just last year, there was a big exhibition of Iliazd that included material from his entire career in Russia. And that was on the initiative of book collectors. So the people who had been collecting the art books, who have gradually discovered that there's all this other stuff, and they kind of wanted to have, see the thing whole. But I have this feeling all the time that that this is probably the most high-profile publication that this novel has ever had in any language, and that it will probably be introduced to some Russians this way, and they can go back and say, "Oh yeah, what is that? Let me read it in Russian." It was translated into French in the early '80s, and there are a couple of translators in France who have been systematically going through Iliazd's work and translating it, including the transrational stuff, which is like, I don't know if I got through everything.
No.
You were.
Yeah, that's great. We have one more question here.
Can you talk about that everythingism sort of impulse that he had for a while? When first was that just kind of a movement of one? Was it just him, or?
It was it was Iliazd, his friend Mikhail Ledantiu, who died at the end of the war, and also Mikhail Larionov kind of also endorsed this. Goncharova and Larionov left Russia before the war started. They left in spring 1914, and then they lived the rest of their lives in Paris, and became very well-known artists in their own right. And I don't think that Larionov held on to that everythingism idea. Iliazd continued to call himself an everythingist the rest of his life.
Do you think how do you think it shows up in the Rapture, if it does?
In Rapture, it's
Maybe all the different themes.
Yeah,
Of everything.
Venya had given me these questions for an interview that's on the blog for the publisher, and one of them was about kind of the references that are in the novel, and I was saying, like, I mean, I can't get all of them. I don't know. I mean, but there are so many levels where this novel is working, and I don't know how many of them are happening in the English translation, but I hope people can find a few things. But he's drawing on modern linguistics. So he developed in this same milieu that gave us the Moscow Linguistics Circle with Roman Jakobson, and Payaz with Viktor Shklovsky, and he's working with some of the linguistic things that were coming out of there, as well as Khlebnikov's weirder ideas about letters and sounds. There's Freud, there's Nietzsche. I mean, it's full of references to Russian literature, which will be from symbolism, Alexander Blok, but also lots of Dostoevsky, and Romanticism. So Russian Romanticism, there's Tyutchev, there's Pushkin, there's and then German Romanticism. So I find a lot of dialogue with novels by Novalis and by Hölderlin. That's another aspect of Rossum's question. That at the time he's working on this, he's working with the Surrealists. So this came out around the same time as some of the early Surrealist prose, like Breton's Nadia and Aragon's Paris Peasant. And so they're all working with things like same kind of things that they're talking about, Gothic novels, but there's a level where he's dealing with fairy tales. There's a lot of kind of medieval quest literature. There's Ovid. So going back to classical mythology, and all of it kind of trying to, his one sentence summation of what this novel is about is it's about poetry as an always, I'm going to completely mess this up, but it has to do with the criminal attempt with unsuitable means.
A commentary on the idea of poetry is always a vain endeavor.
Yeah, it's always a vain endeavor. So he's looking at different ways of getting to whatever this poetic essence is throughout human history. I think there's folklore stuff. There's so for people who have other angles onto the novel, I'm sure that there's a whole lot of stuff that I don't see. Or I've just become so impressed with Iliazd that I imagine he's kind of all-knowing, which he, might like. But
do we have any other?
So one of the things that I really enjoy about the novel is the way that Iliazd is so closely associated with nature and with animals in a way that's really productive and really powerful, and sort of isn't flattening of her character at all. And I'm wondering if you sort of have any thoughts, either Tom or Jen, about, do you think that people who sort of work on animal studies or the environmental humanities are going to sort of have different readings of this? Like, do you think sort of these new movements will tell us new things about the work?
Well, you mentioned in the introduction, I think, on the level of sound, that there's a lot of animal sounds, nature sounds, and that sonically it's very post-humanist. And that strikes me as sort of something that comes out of futurism and their interest in kind of language produced not by humans but by animals and that sort of thing.
There's and that's something that in this novel is never represented. So you don't have onomatopoeia in this novel. You don't actually have transrational beyond sense language in this novel. It's talked about. It's referred to. There's almost a sense that Iliazd he felt like he had gone as far as he could go with the transrational language, and that didn't quite take him where he needed to go, so he needs to be gesturing towards some kind of, sometimes it's gesturing toward silence, sometimes it's gesturing toward these non-human sounds, like something that's, but the rocks make sounds and the stars make sounds, and in that, I mean, that's one of the things that I find is another echo back to German Romanticism and like Novalis, is just this, some kind of a rapport with the non-human here.
But also he's interested in the noises that human bodies make that aren't language.
Right, yeah.
The different grunts and like groans and flatulence and things like that.
There's a lot of scatology, and it's very one of the things that he was getting from Freud and from his work with Kruchonik. There's a lot of I guess scatology and sexual kind of double entendres, and but the unpronounceable Hamlet, the name of that Hamlet is, at one point it's actually specified that it's a beyond sense name. It's a transrational name. And again, we're not given it, but there are Cretans who live in the village and they sing songs that are in this form. And it's indicated. It's something it's not represented, it's just indicated. The lizards have sounds. There's the monk, when he's going over the mountains, at one point he starts howling, and all of nature joins him in a big chorus. There's another family in the hamlet where everyone has huge goiters, and the patriarch of that family, he doesn't like dogs. He says, I do the work myself, so he howls a lot in the novel. But it's keyed to, I guess, something that language isn't quite getting to. And there's, I think I also mentioned in the blog that on my days of feeling very weak as a translator, I kind of imagined that there's another version of this to be translated where you pay attention to a whole different level of kind of puns and innuendos, and there was Yale University Press had last year, I think, had published simultaneously two versions of an Irish modernist novel, because it wasn't really possible to have one translation. You had to approach it from two different ways and then kind of try to triangulate. But
do you have any other? Can I just? I really want to ask. Okay, I really want to ask about this Nigerian princess, because it was the strangest story. So when he was a teenager, this is what I read. When he was a teenager, he wrote his mother and said, "I'm just letting you know that I've married an African princess. She's on her way to you. You're gonna have to take care of her. Try to understand she's from a different culture." And it was like a lie, like it was a joke. It was like him playing with this kind of, fake reality and like the absurd. But then that really happened. He actually really, later on in life, he really married a Nigerian princess. It was the strangest thing.
There are photos from that period when he was a young man, and he wrote those letters to his mother. And there are photos of him with this young girl.
Okay.
And I don't know where she was from, and I don't know, what more there is, if anything, to this story.
And he didn't have any kind of, because it seems like there's sort of a lifelong interest in Africa, and I was just wondering if that came across in any of his work, in his writing.
I don't find it so much directly in his writing, although certainly, again, he's moving in these circles, especially in Paris, with the Dadaists and Picasso and the people who are interested in African art. And the Dadaists are coming up with all this, pseudo-African stuff that they're doing. So I don't know what happened with this first episode. And that's another mysterious thing, but there are photos of him with this girl. And he wrote to his mother and said, I'm sending her, you should take care of her until she's old enough for me to marry her. She's like 12 years old or something. And I don't know what happened to her. But then later on, the way that he made money in the 20s in Paris was by doing textile design. And he ended up being the director of one of Chanel's factories. And his first marriage was to a Chanel model. And they had a couple of children, but it didn't work out. She left him within 5 years or something. And then his second wife was this Nigerian princess who was attending the Sorbonne that he met right before World War II, and they got married, and they had a child. And it must be soon after the child was born that the Nazi invasion happened in 1940, and because she was a British subject, she was interned. So she spent the war in a camp where she contracted tuberculosis, and by the time of her release in 1944, she was in pretty bad shape, so she died within 6 months of her release from the camp.
The wife or the child?
The wife.
Okay.
The wife. And again, I don't know what happened to the child. I think his own children all predeceased him, because the heirs are through his third wife's children, who were his stepchildren. But in 1948, he published this volume that was it's one of his art books. So he recruited like 26 different artists to be involved in it, like all huge names, and collected different kinds of things that could be precursors to transrational poetry, or things that were happening simultaneously with Russian transrational poetry, so Dada. And he created an anthology which he called The Poetry of Unknown Words. But the first thing in the book is poetry by his Nigerian wife. So that whole book was kind of a memorial for her. And there is, I think it's already kind of, it's already evident in Rapture, but somewhat even earlier, that this transrational, whatever they were trying to get at with transrational poetry, this thing that they can never quite achieve, is also, it's a very death-haunted thing. So transrational language for Iliazd later in his life is very much associated with memorials, and most of the poetry he wrote later was in memory of people who had died in the Spanish Civil War, people who had died in the resistance in World War II. Almost all of his poetry later is memorial poetry in a very explicit way.
Great, so I think we're gonna have a reception now, but so join me in thanking Thomas for a great conversation.